The chapel lights hummed, steady and low, casting a pale yellow over rows of empty chairs. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, sweet but stale, as if it had been sitting there for days without change. Outside, the street was silent. Tuesday afternoons in a small town always were. It was just me, the coffin, and the end of another service. I'd closed up after dozens of viewings before, checking the flowers, arranging leftover programs, making sure the casket was secure before the hearse arrived in the morning. Routine. Predictable. Safe. At least, it should have been. I set my clipboard down on the front pew and stepped closer to the casket. The mahogany lid gleamed under the dim lights, the brass handles polished to perfection. I placed my hand on one of them, ready to finish the lock before heading out. That's when I heard it, so faint I almost thought it was the building settling. A scrape. From inside. Every muscle in my body tensed. I froze, listening. Another scrape, longer this time, followed by a muffled thump. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Air pockets, wood shifting, anything but what it sounded like. But then the lid shuddered, just enough to break the seal of silence. Slowly, cautiously, I reached forward and lifted it a few inches. The smell of preserved flowers mixed with something else, warm, sharp, alive. And then I saw them. Eyes. Open. Blinking against the light. Not the vacant, glassy stare I had seen when we prepared him that morning. These were focused, on me. A hand shot up, cold but strong, gripping my wrist with desperate force. His lips moved, barely parting, until I heard the words, ragged, weak, and urgent. Don't trust. He didn't finish. His head fell back, eyes still open, chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. I stood there, heart pounding in my ears, my hand still caught in his grip. My first instinct was to call for help, but the silence around us felt dangerous. Something in the way he looked at me, pleading, warning, made me hesitate. Then, from the back of the chapel, a sound broke the stillness. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, drawing closer. I released his hand, stepped back, and turned toward the door. Whoever it was hadn't been at the service earlier. And something told me they weren't here to mourn. The footsteps echoed against the chapel's wooden floor, each one deliberate, slow enough to make me wonder if they already knew I was here. I stepped sideways, instinctively putting myself between the casket and the approaching figure. A tall man emerged from the shadows at the far end of the aisle, his suit dark, tie loose, eyes fixed on me in a way that made the air feel even heavier. I'd never seen him before, not at the service, not around town. That alone was strange in a place where everyone knew everyone. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice steady but flat. No curiosity, no surprise. Almost rehearsed. I swallowed, my pulse still thundering in my ears. "You shouldn't be here. The service is over." His gaze flicked past me to the coffin. "Just came to pay my respects." Before I could answer, the man inside the coffin moved again, a faint shift of his shoulders, the slightest turn of his head. I glanced down, and his eyes were locked on the man standing in front of us. There was fear in them now, sharp and unhidden. The stranger's jaw tightened. "Why don't you go make yourself a coffee?" he said, as if dismissing me. "No," I said, more firmly than I felt. "I think we should call an ambulance." A pause. His stare hardened, but his voice stayed calm. "That won't be necessary." That was the moment I knew, whoever this man was, he didn't want help to arrive. I ignored him, pulling my phone from my pocket. But before I could dial, the man in the coffin's grip tightened around my wrist again, just enough for me to feel something pressed into my palm, a folded piece of paper. His breathing was shallow, his eyes pleading. The stranger took a step forward, and instinct took over. I slipped the paper into my pocket before anyone could see. "I'll close up," I said quickly. "You can have your moment." I moved past him, feeling his eyes follow me until I stepped into the hallway. The first thing I did was unfold the paper. A single line of handwriting stared back at me, shaky, uneven, written in haste. An address. No name. No explanation. Just an address in a part of town I hadn't been to in years. I looked back toward the chapel doors. The stranger was still inside. The man in the coffin was still breathing. And whatever this address meant, I had the sinking feeling it was the reason someone wanted him to stay dead. The address burned in my mind the entire walk back to my car. Even as I turned the ignition, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting the tall stranger to follow. He never came out of the chapel, but the unease stayed with me, settling somewhere deep, like a weight I couldn't shake off. I drove through streets I knew too well. The neat brick houses of the center of town eventually gave way to cracked sidewalks, boarded-up windows, and graffiti-scarred walls. The address led me to a narrow alley between an old hardware store and a laundromat that hadn't been open in years. The building was small, 2 stories, its windows covered with newspaper from the inside. No lights, no sign of life. I stepped out of the car and checked the paper again. Same number, same street name. The front door was locked, but it was the kind of lock that looked like it hadn't been changed in decades. I knocked once. Nothing. Knocked again. Harder. A faint sound came from inside. Not footsteps exactly, more like something dragging across the floor. Then, silence. I tried the handle. To my surprise, it turned halfway before catching. The door was bolted from the inside. My instinct told me to leave, but that same instinct also told me the man in the coffin hadn't handed me this address for nothing. I walked around to the back of the building, where a rusted fire escape clung to the brick like an afterthought. The metal groaned under my weight as I climbed. The second-floor window was cracked open just enough to slip a hand through. I pushed it, and the stale air that hit me carried the smell of dust, damp wood, and something faintly metallic, blood, maybe, but old. Inside was dim, the only light coming through gaps in the boarded windows. The floor was littered with old newspapers, broken furniture, and a single overturned chair. And then I saw it. Against the far wall, half hidden under a dusty sheet, was a door set into the floor. A basement hatch. I crossed the room slowly, each step loud in the stillness. My fingers curled around the handle and I pulled. The hinges screamed in protest. The smell was stronger now, metallic, sour, unmistakable. I reached for my phone's flashlight and shined it into the opening. The beam landed on rows of shelves, stacked with unmarked cardboard boxes. In the center of the room, a single wooden chair sat under a dangling light bulb. Beside it, on the floor, was a strip of cloth darkened with dried blood. Before I could make sense of it, something else caught my eye, scratches on the concrete, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. A noise from behind made me spin. The hatch slammed shut. And I wasn't alone anymore. The slam of the hatch echoed through the empty building, leaving me in complete darkness except for the weak beam from my phone. My heart jumped into my throat. I scrambled to push the hatch back open, but it didn't budge. Something heavy was holding it down from above. "Hello." My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Who's there?" Silence. Then came the sound of slow, measured footsteps on the floor above. 1, 2, 3, and then nothing. Whoever had shut me in wasn't rushing to leave. They were listening. I turned my flashlight back toward the basement and forced myself to focus. Rows of boxes, the chair, the blood-stained cloth, it all felt staged, like a warning. I crouched by one of the boxes and peeled back the tape. Inside were dozens of photographs, all of them slightly yellowed at the edges. The first was of the man from the coffin, alive, younger, smiling. The second showed him again, but with the tall stranger from the chapel. In both, their eyes seemed to avoid the camera, as if they didn't want to be caught together. The third photo made my hands go cold. It was of me, standing outside the funeral home last week, talking to a coworker, taken from a distance. I shoved the photo back into the box, my pulse hammering. This wasn't just about the man in the coffin. Somehow, I was already part of whatever this was. The faint creak of the hatch opening broke my thoughts. A sliver of light appeared above. A voice, low, familiar, slipped through. "You weren't supposed to come here, Charlie." It was the tall stranger. I backed up, gripping my phone like a weapon. Who is he? The man in the coffin. Why is he alive? A pause. The man sighed, almost regretfully. Alive isn't the word I'd use. He knows things. Things that could ruin everything. And now, so do you. The hatch closed again, the bolt sliding into place. His footsteps retreated. The sound of a door upstairs slamming made the silence return in full. I didn't waste time. I dragged one of the shelves under the hatch, climbed onto it, and pushed with everything I had. The bolt gave way, and the hatch swung open enough for me to squeeze out. By the time I reached the street, the stranger was gone. I drove straight to the hospital. I needed answers from the only person who might give them. But when I got there, the nurse at the desk frowned. There's no one here by that description. No one admitted from the funeral home. I described him again: age, build, the deep scar on his temple. She shook her head. Sir, there's been no new admissions all day. I left, the weight in my chest growing heavier. Either they'd moved him before I arrived, or he had never made it here at all. When I got back to my car, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. One new message. It was a photo. The man from the coffin, sitting upright, alive, in a dark room. His eyes locked on the camera. Below it, a single line of text. They know you opened the coffin. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. A second message appeared before I could react. And they're already here.